On the edge of the cold northern sea stood a forgotten village called Black Reef. The village was small, hidden between dark cliffs and endless forests where the wind sounded like whispers during the night. Fishermen lived there for generations, and every family knew the stories about the sea. Some stories were beautiful, while others were filled with fear. But among all the legends, there was one story people almost never spoke about. The story of the last lantern. Ethan Carter arrived in Black Reef during the first week of November. He was 24 years old, tired from the noise of the city, and carrying more sadness than luggage. A year earlier, his father had disappeared during a storm while working on a cargo ship. No body was ever found. Since then, Ethan spent his days wondering if his father's final moments had been filled with fear or peace. He rented a small house near the harbor. The locals watched him carefully but rarely spoke. Black Reef was the kind of place where strangers remained strangers for a long time. On his second evening, Ethan walked along the rocky shore while thick fog rolled over the sea. That was when he noticed the lighthouse. It stood alone on a distant cliff far from the village. Tall, dark, and silent. But strangely, there was no light. An old fisherman sitting nearby noticed Ethan staring. "You should stay away from that place," the fisherman muttered. "Why?" Ethan asked. The old man looked toward the sea before answering. "Because some lights are not meant to return." Before Ethan could ask another question, the fisherman stood and disappeared into the fog. That night, Ethan could not sleep. Rain tapped against the windows while waves crashed against the cliffs below. Around midnight he looked outside and froze. Far away, on the cliff where the abandoned lighthouse stood, a pale golden light suddenly appeared. One single lantern. Swinging slowly in the darkness. The next morning Ethan asked the villagers about it, but nobody wanted to answer. Some ignored him completely. Others crossed themselves and walked away. Only one person finally spoke. An old woman named Margaret who owned the village bakery. "The lighthouse keeper died 30 years ago," she whispered quietly. "After the great storm." "What happened?" Ethan asked. Margaret hesitated. "They found the lighthouse empty. But the lantern was still burning." Ethan leaned closer. "And the keeper?" "They never found him." That evening curiosity pulled Ethan toward the cliffs. The wind was strong, and the narrow path looked dangerous, but he continued climbing until he finally reached the lighthouse. Up close it looked ancient. Rust covered the iron door, and broken windows faced the raging sea like empty eyes. Yet when Ethan touched the door, it slowly opened. Inside, the air smelled of salt and old wood. Dust covered everything except for strange footprints leading upward. Fresh footprints. Ethan's heart pounded as he climbed the spiral stairs. Step. 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 The wind howled outside. At the top of the tower he found something unexpected. A lantern. Still glowing. And beside it stood a man wearing a dark coat. The stranger looked old, with gray hair and pale skin, but his eyes seemed strangely alive. "You shouldn't be here," the man said softly. Ethan stepped backward. "Who are you?" The old man stared at the sea. "I keep the light burning." "That's impossible," Ethan whispered. "The lighthouse keeper died years ago." The man slowly smiled. "Some duties do not end with death." Lightning flashed across the sky. For one terrifying second Ethan noticed something horrifying. The old man's body looked transparent. Like smoke. Ethan stumbled backward in fear. But the ghost did not move toward him. Instead, he pointed toward the dark ocean. "Do you see them?" Far below, through the storm, Ethan noticed shadows moving beneath the waves. Hundreds of shadows. Like figures walking underwater. "What are they?" Ethan asked. "The lost," the keeper answered quietly. "Sailors who never found their way home." The lantern suddenly flickered. The ghost's expression darkened. "The light is fading." Outside, thunder exploded across the sky. Massive waves smashed against the cliffs. What happens if it goes out? Ethan asked. The keeper looked at him with sorrow. They return. At that exact moment the lantern dimmed again. Then Ethan heard it. Voices. Soft at first. Whispering from below the cliffs. He rushed to the window and felt terror crawl through his body. Dark figures were emerging from the sea. Human shapes covered in water and seaweed slowly climbing the rocks. Dozens of them. Their empty eyes stared toward the lighthouse. The storm weakens the barrier, the ghost said. Every year they try to return. Why are you telling me this? The old keeper turned toward Ethan. Because I cannot hold the lantern much longer. The room became colder. The ghost looked weaker with every passing second. Ethan stared at the glowing lantern. What do I do? The keeper stepped aside. You must choose. Outside the dead sailors climbed higher. Ethan could hear their wet footsteps below the tower stairs. Fear screamed inside him to run. But another feeling stopped him. For the first time since his father disappeared, Ethan felt something stronger than grief. Purpose. He grabbed the lantern. Instantly warmth spread through his hands. Strange visions flooded his mind, storms, shipwrecks, desperate sailors praying for survival. And among them, his father. Standing on the deck of a sinking ship. Looking directly at Ethan. Not afraid. At peace. Tears filled Ethan's eyes. The ghost keeper smiled gently. The sea remembers everyone. The footsteps reached the tower door. Bang. 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 The dead were trying to enter. What do I do now? Ethan shouted. Keep the light burning until dawn. The lantern suddenly grew brighter in Ethan's hands. Outside, the dead figures screamed as golden light poured from the tower windows. The sound was terrible, like thousands of lost souls crying together. The tower shook violently. Bang. 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 Cracks spread across the walls. Ethan held the lantern tighter while fear clawed at his chest. Hours passed. The storm raged endlessly. Again and again the dead tried to climb the tower, but the lantern pushed them back. And through it all, the ghost keeper stood beside Ethan silently watching the sea. Until finally, the first light of morning appeared on the horizon. The storm slowly faded. One by one the dark figures disappeared beneath the waves. Silence returned. Ethan looked beside him. The ghost keeper was fading away. Wait, Ethan said. What happens now? The old man smiled peacefully. Now the light belongs to you. Then he vanished. Only the lantern remained. Days passed after the storm. The villagers noticed something different about Ethan. He no longer looked lost. Every evening he walked to the lighthouse carrying the lantern. And every night, far above the cliffs, a golden light shined across the dark sea once more. Some villagers believed the old curse was finally broken. Others believed the lighthouse had simply found a new keeper. But sailors crossing the northern waters still tell stories even now. Stories about a lonely lighthouse standing against the storms. And during the darkest nights, they swear they can see two figures beside the lantern. One young. One old. Guarding the sea together forever.